She was curled around nothing, her body frozen, her eyes open. But what made Eli drop to his knees was the sound that followed, faint, trembling, and coming from under the snow. It was early March in Elk Valley, British Columbia. Snow still blanketed the foothills in thick, silent drifts. Eli Brenner, a retired forestry ranger, had been checking storm-damaged trails that morning. A late blizzard had torn through the valley days before, leaving downed branches, broken signage, and a landscape freshly powdered and deceivingly calm. Scout, his aging Malamute, had veered off the path, nose high, tail rigid. That's when Eli heard it too, the sound no one expects in deep snow. A chirping cry, raw and broken. He followed Scout's lead down into a shallow hollow near the ridge, where a soft mound of snow looked unnatural, flattened, disturbed. Eli brushed back the top layer with a gloved hand. The shape beneath emerged slowly, a lynx, maybe 30 pounds, fur dusted in frost, eyes glassy but still wide open. She had clearly died recently, but her body wasn't limp. It was curled, tense even in death, protective. Then it came again, a sound, almost like a squeaky hinge from the base of her torso. Eli leaned closer, heart pounding. With great care, he shifted her body aside. 3 kittens, not moving, not crying, just barely breathing. Their tiny forms huddled close together in a depression barely protected by the mother's lifeless form and a fallen pine bough. They couldn't have been more than 2 weeks old. Eyes cloudy, ears flat. No chance they'd make it another night out here. Maybe not even another hour. Eli didn't think. He simply moved. He shed his coat, scooped them up into his wool hunting shirt beneath, and zipped everything shut inside his chest. The cold of their bodies against his ribs somehow told him just how close they were to slipping away. Scout circled tight, whining low, watching him with those worried old eyes. "Come on, girl," Eli murmured, standing. "We've got a job now." They pushed through the snow for nearly 2 miles back to the cabin. Eli's knees ached, but he didn't slow. Each step seemed to matter. Like if he stopped, one of those tiny hearts might stop too. The cabin was small, off-grid, built by Eli's grandfather, and kept mostly cool this time of year. But Eli fired up the wood stove with shaking fingers, stacking birch and cedar in reckless piles. The room filled with warmth fast. He found a worn flannel blanket in the storage chest, the one his wife used to use when she read by the window, and folded it into a shallow box. Then, with the caution of a man handling glass, he unwrapped the kittens and placed them into the box beside the fire. They didn't cry, didn't twitch, just tiny, soft ribs lifting shallowly. Eli sat back on his heels, suddenly unsure of what came next. He'd spent decades tracking wild animals, rescuing wounded owls, releasing bears. But these were babies. These were orphans. And he had no idea what a lynx kitten was supposed to eat. He rummaged through the pantry, his mind racing. Powdered goat's milk. Old droppers from when Scout was a pup. Maybe, just maybe. He mixed the milk with boiled water, cooled it quickly in a snow-filled pot. When he tried to feed the smallest one, the liquid simply ran down its chin. The others didn't even open their mouths. "No," Eli whispered. "Don't you dare give up on me." For hours, he tried. One drop at a time, one whisper at a time. He moved them to the warmest part of the floor, pulled his chair close, wrapped the blanket tighter. The sun fell. The fire crackled. Scout lay silently by the box, ears perked. And then, just past midnight, one of the kittens let out a tiny cry. Eli sat up, breath caught in his chest. The biggest one, a pale male with faint black spots, opened its mouth, latched clumsily onto the dropper, and swallowed. It was the smallest act, but to Eli, it felt like watching the sun rise again after a very long winter. By morning, all three had taken a few sips, not enough to promise survival, but enough to make Eli believe it was possible. He barely slept, dozing upright in his chair with Scout occasionally nosing his arm. When the light crept in through the frost-rimmed windows, Eli stirred the fire and bent over the box again. The kittens were nestled tightly, two of them breathing with tiny huffs, the third, still the smallest, barely rising and falling. He hadn't moved much since the night before. Eli cupped him in his calloused hands and whispered something low. Not a prayer exactly, just a plea the way a man talks when there's no one around to listen but the wild. "Hang on, little Maple," he said softly. "You got more life in you yet." He hadn't meant to name them. But as the hours passed, the names arrived like memories, returning from long ago. The pale spotted male he called Birch. Steady, bold, the darker, quiet one became Rowan. And the smallest, with just a dash of flame color on her forehead, was Maple. The name caught in his throat every time he said it. He wrapped them in strips of an old wool scarf, creating little slings he could warm against his chest while he boiled more water for milk, cleaned their bedding, and read every line of an old wildlife manual he dug up from a trunk in the attic. Most of it was outdated, some of it just plain wrong. But the routine helped settle the panic that scratched behind his ribs. By the second afternoon, Birch had started squirming before each feeding. His strength surprised Eli. Rowan followed not long after, fussing quietly, rolling toward his brother in the blanket. But Maple, she stayed still. Too still. Her breaths were whispers of motion, and Eli had to hold his fingers over her ribs just to be sure she was still with him. The temperature dropped that night, and Eli stoked the fire hotter than he had in years. He laid Scout's old puppy crate beside it and lined it with hot water bottles and his thickest flannels. Then, without fanfare, he set the kittens inside and curled up in the rocking chair to watch over them. He didn't cry when Maple stopped breathing. He just stopped rocking. The silence was heavier than anything he'd felt in years. He reached into the crate and lifted her tiny body, still warm, and pressed her to his chest. Scout looked up from the corner, ears lowered, tail still. She was the quiet one, Eli murmured. The kind that slips out before anyone realizes they were the heart of the whole thing. He buried her that night, just outside the cabin, beneath a pine stump softened by years of snow. He marked it with a smooth, flat stone from the creek, carved a simple maple leaf into it with his pocket knife. Birch and Rowan slept on, unaware. Eli envied them for that. The next morning, he packed the truck. There was a name scribbled into the back of one of the field guides, a wildlife biologist who handled rescue cases in this part of the province. Dr. Hallie Quinn lived part-time in a ranger station up in Hollow Creek, nearly 3 hours away if the roads were clear. He didn't know what else to do. The road was rough, still half buried from the storm. Eli drove slow, one hand on the crate beside him, Scout riding in the bed under a tarp. Every now and then he'd glance down to see Birch trying to climb over Rowan or batting softly at the blanket folds. Hope, he'd learned, was never loud. It crept in quietly, asking nothing, demanding everything. Dr. Quinn's cabin sat on the edge of a frozen lake, its roof crowned with snow and smoke curling from a thin chimney. She met him at the door before he could even knock. "You're Eli Brenner, aren't you?" she said, brushing a wisp of silver hair from her cheek. "I got your message. Bring them in." He followed her through a narrow hallway lined with antlers, feathers, and worn books. The warmth inside smelled like cedar and coffee. She led him to a side room that doubled as a lab, and when she opened the crate, her breath caught. "Canadian lynx," she said. "You weren't kidding." She lifted Birch gently, her fingers moving with a confidence Eli hadn't seen in years. 3 weeks old, maybe a little less. These two are fighters. Eli swallowed. There were 3. Hallie glanced at him, then nodded. "You did right. Most people would have left them." He didn't answer, just watched as she examined Rowan, checking joints, listening for heartbeat, testing hydration. "They've got a shot," she said finally, "if you're willing to keep going." Eli blinked. "You mean I keep them?" "With my help, and a lot of formula." "But yes, they know your smell now. That matters more than you think." He looked down at the 2 little bodies, nestled again in that worn flannel blanket. "I owe it to them," he said. What he didn't say, what burned behind his ribs like kindling, was that he owed it to Maple too. The next weeks blurred into a rhythm Eli hadn't known he was missing. Every 3 hours like clockwork, the alarm on his old watch would chime, and he'd prepare the warmed formula Dr. Quinn had sent him home with. Birch and Rowan adapted quickly. Or maybe it was Eli who adapted. There was comfort in the routine, even when it came at the cost of sleep and solitude. Scout had taken to sleeping just outside their enclosure, ever the guardian. He rarely barked these days, but every now and then, when a lynx cry pierced the night air far off in the trees, his ears would twitch and his eyes would scan the shadows. The call always faded without answer. Eli had moved the kittens from the box beside the fire to a handmade enclosure in the cabin sunroom, if you could call the wide-windowed corner that. He'd padded it with old rugs and stacked driftwood and pine branches to mimic the textures of a forest floor. Rowan immediately claimed the largest hollow beneath the log pile, while Birch insisted on climbing everything with chaotic energy that made Eli laugh more than once. Naming them had sealed the bond. But it was something deeper that grew between them now. An understanding. He never tried to touch them too much. He didn't cuddle or overhandle. They weren't pets. But they knew his presence. They came when he called, not because they were trained, but because they wanted to. Birch was always first, bounding over with a little chirp, tail high, ears perked. Rowan followed with quiet dignity, slower, more methodical. It was Rowan who watched Eli the closest, who blinked slow when Eli sat by the enclosure, lost in thought. Hallie had said that was a cat's way of saying they trusted you. By their 5th week, the kittens were eating minced rabbit mixed with formula. Eli made the blend himself, sourcing meat from a local trapper who understood the situation and didn't ask questions. The shift from bottle to meat was another small milestone, one of dozens Eli had begun to track like a man counting stars. And yet, despite the victories, Maple's absence hovered like mist. There were moments when Rowan tilted his head just so, or when Birch let out a high-pitched mewl in his sleep, that Eli could almost feel her there. He'd find himself turning toward the pine stump outside, toward the little grave, half expecting to see movement. He never said her name aloud anymore, not even to Scout. One night, after a long feeding session, Eli stepped outside with a mug of black tea. The stars above Elk Valley stretched in quiet clusters, sharp against the blackness. The air was crisp, but not cruel. He stood barefoot on the porch, letting the cold seep into his bones, letting it wake up the parts of him that had gone numb years ago. Since the fire. Since the accident. Since her. Eli hadn't meant to think of his wife tonight. But grief worked like that. It borrowed keys to every door and slipped in uninvited. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the photograph. It was yellowed now, the corners soft from years of folding. Her face was tilted upward, laughing, sunlight in her hair. He kept the photo not for the image, but for the smell. Her lotion had soaked into it long ago, vanilla and cedar. When he heard the rustle behind him, he turned. Birch stood at the door, somehow having slipped the latch. He didn't run out, just stood there, blinking in the moonlight, head tilted. "You little devil," Eli chuckled, scooping him up with one arm. "If you're gonna escape, at least take Rowan with you." Birch mewed in protest, then curled into Eli's chest as if he belonged there. Eli looked out across the clearing. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called. He held the lynx kitten close, feeling the soft thrum of life under its ribs. For a moment, just one, the ache inside his chest loosened. That night, he placed the photograph on the shelf above the enclosure, tucking it between a jar of formula and a folded towel. "She would have liked you too," he whispered. "She always had a soft spot for wild things." By week 6, the wildness began to show. Rowan stalked invisible prey across the enclosure, his hind legs twitching just before he pounced. Birch had started claiming the high ground, leaping from branch to beam with reckless joy. Eli extended the enclosure to include part of the back room and installed a netted door to the cabin's small side yard. With Hallie's blessing, he began letting them explore supervised patches of snow-covered terrain. They chased wind shadows and dug at buried leaves. The world, once narrow and warm, was now wide and waking. And Eli, quietly, was waking too. He still dreamed of Maple sometimes, of the way she hadn't moved, of what he might have done differently. But each morning brought 2 warm bodies pressing against the netting, ready to play. Each sunrise reminded him he hadn't failed completely, and that had to be enough, for now. By the time the first spring thaw melted the ice from the edges of the creek, Birch and Rowan had outgrown the indoor enclosure entirely. They needed space now, real space, not just pine branches in the sunroom, so Eli built it. With Scout overseeing every hammer strike, Eli fenced off a wide section of the property behind the cabin. He reinforced it with wire mesh buried deep and tall posts wrapped in bark and rope. Inside, he planted deadfall branches and scattered rocks, creating a mock terrain that mimicked the mountain edge. A small pool formed from runoff, shallow and clear. The moment the kittens stepped into the outdoor pen, something in them shifted. Birch bounded forward first, darting between stumps and rolling in the dirt like it belonged to him. Rowan moved slower, but with sharper intention, sniffing, stalking, testing shadows. For a moment, they paused and looked at Eli through the mesh, eyes golden and alert. And then they vanished into the artificial wild. Eli stayed outside most of that first day, sitting on the old bench near the fence, sipping from his thermos, Scout curled by his boots. The lynx were learning, stretching muscles made for a life beyond walls. He watched them climb, leap, and chase birdsong. And somewhere in that quiet wilderness, something stirred inside him too. The days blurred into a new rhythm. Mornings were for feeding and cleaning. Afternoons were for supervised exploration. Evenings brought a slow walk through the woods with Scout while the lynx lounged under cedar trees, too lazy to stalk bugs. Dr. Quinn visited twice a month, bringing supplies and updates from the Cascadia Wildlife Sanctuary. She was always impressed by their progress. "They're thriving, Eli. Not just surviving. That's rare," she said one morning as Rowan leapt to the top perch in the pen. "They're strong, wild. That's what we want." Eli nodded, but his stomach twisted. Because for all the praise, he knew what was coming. At some point, they'd outgrow even this. "How do you know when it's time?" he asked quietly. Hallie looked toward the fence where Birch paced restlessly. They'll tell you, not with words, with distance. The moment came sooner than Eli expected. It was Rowan who first changed. He began pacing at night, pressing his nose to the gate, vocalizing low and strange. Birch followed suit, less intense, but equally unsettled. They fought more, not cruelly, but instinctively. There was tension in their play now, a testing of boundaries. Scout growled once during feeding time when Birch lunged at the fence. Eli knew the signs. He'd seen them in wolves, in bears, in kids even. That restless stretch before freedom calls. He sat by the pen one night, rubbing the leather cord of his wife's old necklace between his fingers. The lynx moved in and out of the trees, shadows in motion. Rowan stopped and stared at him for a long time. Then something happened. Rowan climbed the far fence. Eli had never seen him do it before. The cat didn't leap down or bolt. He just perched on top, body tensed, ears scanning. Scout stood up, growling low. "Stay," Eli said, placing a hand on her shoulder. Rowan stared into the woods. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked at Eli. Their eyes locked for a heartbeat, long enough for Eli to feel the knot form in his chest. Then Rowan leapt. Gone. Eli ran, through the brush, past the trees, calling quietly, then loudly. Scout barked twice, trying to pick up the trail. But there was nothing. Rowan had vanished into the forest like smoke. For hours, Eli searched. He scanned the creek beds, called along the ridgeline, even circled back to Maple's grave, as if Rowan might have gone there. But there was only silence, and tracks leading nowhere. That night, he sat in the cabin, the doors unlocked, lights dimmed. Birch paced the enclosure, unsettled. Scout refused to eat. Eli barely noticed when dawn arrived. He was still sitting on the porch, his back aching, his heart raw, when he heard it. A cry. Not from the woods, from the path. Rowan. Eli stood slowly. The lynx was limping slightly, but he walked straight up to the pen's entrance and sat. Proud, dignified, eyes steady. Birch ran to the gate. Scout barked once, low and uncertain. Eli didn't move. He just looked. "All right," he said quietly. "I hear you." Rowan hadn't run away. He'd gone to prove something. And now he was back, not to stay, but to say goodbye. Eli opened the gate and Rowan walked through, brushing lightly against his leg as he passed. Then he curled beside Birch, both cats silent. That night, Eli didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds outside, the rustle of leaves, the shift of weight. He didn't cry, but he knew. It was almost time. The morning after Rowan's return, the air in Elk Valley felt different. A stillness hung between the trees, like nature itself had paused to listen. Eli didn't open the enclosure gate that day. He didn't need to. Both lynx knew. They stayed close to the fence line, watching him as he moved through his routine, feeding Scout, boiling water for coffee, chopping wood. He kept glancing over, expecting them to be gone. But they lingered. For now. He called Hallie that afternoon. "I think it's time," he said. There was a long pause. "I figured," she replied gently. "I've got space prepped for them. We can transport them this weekend if you're ready." Was he ready? He wasn't sure, but he knew they were. The sanctuary, Cascadia Wildlife, sat across a winding mountain range, tucked against a forest preserve Eli had only visited once in his ranger days. It was remote, but respected. Hallie had told him they housed lynx, cougars, bears, any wild orphan that couldn't go back or needed the bridge. The next few days became a quiet ritual of letting go. Eli spent longer hours by the enclosure, memorizing how Birch's left ear bent slightly forward, how Rowan circled his food before eating. He made them extra servings of rabbit and quail, warmed just enough to release scent. He added more logs, more hides, not because they needed them, but because he needed to feel like he was still providing something. Scout had sensed the shift too. She laid by the fence line now, ears drooped, tail flat. Sometimes Rowan would press his nose to hers through the mesh, the silent exchange lasting longer than usual. Birch, always the show-off, tried one last time to climb the tallest tree in the enclosure. He made it halfway before misjudging a jump and landing in a bush. Eli laughed, a rare sound these days, the kind that catches you off guard. When the truck arrived Saturday morning, Eli was already waiting. He'd fashioned 2 crates lined with hay and fleece, and each held a worn item of his clothing, not for comfort, necessarily, but for continuity. His old wool shirt lay in Rowan's crate, a knit glove, worn through the thumb, in Birch's. Hallie brought help. 2 handlers, quiet and respectful, followed her lead. "You sure you don't want to ride with them?" she asked. "I'll follow," Eli said, nodding toward his own truck. "I need time to say things I haven't figured out how to say yet." Loading them wasn't easy. Rowan resisted first, growling low, his eyes sharp. But when Eli whispered to him, not words, just soft sounds, he stepped into the crate. Birch followed after a bit of coaxing and a bribe of fresh meat. His tail flicked once as the door latched. Eli stood there, watching the crates in the back of the transport, the weight of finality pressing into his ribs. "You did good," Hallie said quietly. "Most never make it this far." "I didn't do it for me," Eli replied. But even he heard the lie in his own voice. The drive to Cascadia was long and winding. Eli followed the van slowly, Scout beside him in the cab. Every turn brought back a memory. The first time Birch opened his eyes, the first time Rowan curled against his boot. Maple's grave. When they reached the sanctuary, the gates opened into a wide clearing surrounded by tall fencing and thick forest beyond. The enclosures weren't cages. They were pieces of wilderness stitched together with care. Shade trees, climbing boulders, running water. Their space was ready. The handlers carried the crates in silence. Eli followed behind, feeling every step like it was made of stone. When the doors opened, Rowan stepped out first. He didn't run. He didn't look back. He walked forward slowly, surveying the terrain, then climbed onto a large stone ledge and sat, his back to the group. Birch came next, bounding into the grass, circling the enclosure before stopping beneath a cedar tree. Eli stood by the gate, fingers curled around the fencing. His chest ached, but he didn't speak. Then Rowan turned. Not much. Just his head. And their eyes met. A slow blink. Long, intentional. Eli nodded. "I hear you, boy." Scout let out a quiet whine. Eli placed a hand on her head. "They'll be all right," he whispered. He didn't stay long. Hallie offered coffee, but he declined. "Some things are better left with clean edges," he said. On the drive home, the seat beside him felt too empty. Scout sat up, unsettled, glancing toward the rear window more than usual. That night, Eli didn't sit on the porch. He walked to the pine stump, Maple's grave. He knelt, brushing snowmelt from the carved leaf. For the first time since the burial, he spoke aloud. "They made it," he said. His voice cracked. He didn't care. All of them. Because of you. Because you didn't give up. He placed a smooth stone beside the grave, one he'd found in the lynx enclosure earlier that day, warm from the sun. Still holding the heat, the silence in the cabin was a living thing. It filled the rooms where rustling paws once played. It echoed off the floorboards that had creaked beneath soft feline weight. Scout moved slowly those days, her joints stiff, her eyes more tired. She lay by the back door out of habit, occasionally lifting her head when the wind changed, as if listening for sounds she no longer expected to hear. Eli busied himself with small tasks, fixing a cracked drawer, oiling the hinges on the front gate, organizing toolboxes he hadn't opened in years. Anything to keep from noticing the stillness. The photo remained on the shelf above the old flannel blanket. Maple's name, though never spoken, still pressed against his thoughts when dusk fell and the shadows stretched long. 3 weeks passed before Hallie called. "They're doing well," she said. "Better than expected. Rowan's taken over the high perch. Birch prefers the undergrowth. They're adjusting beautifully." Eli didn't say much, just nodded, then realized she couldn't see him. "You should come visit," she added. "They'd know you. I'm sure of it." He didn't answer right away. The thought of seeing them again, wild, free, and not his, brought a kind of ache he wasn't ready to name. But that weekend, he drove back anyway. The sanctuary welcomed him with quiet familiarity. Volunteers waved. A few staff nodded in recognition. Hallie met him at the gate. "They're out in the big enclosure now," she said, leading him through winding trails framed by high fencing and trees. "We had to expand the space. Rowan started scaling the old walls like he was born for it." Eli chuckled under his breath. That sounded about right. When they reached the edge of the enclosure, he paused. Inside, the landscape looked like untouched wilderness. Tall grass, broken logs, a small running stream. He scanned the space slowly. Birch was the first he saw, stalking something unseen in the brush, his movements fluid, silent. Then Rowan, perched high on a boulder, tail flicking lazily. Eli leaned against the fence, watching. After a while, Rowan stood. He didn't leap down or approach, he simply stared. Then, just as he had that day on the fence, he blinked, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't affection. It wasn't dependence. It was acknowledgement. Eli stayed for hours. He didn't call out, didn't try to interfere, just watched, heart full and quiet. As he turned to leave, a voice called after him. "We got another one in yesterday," Hallie said, falling into step beside him. Younger than Birch and Rowan were, barely a week old. Mother was hit by a snowplow on the South Highway. Eli slowed. "Does it have a chance?" "Maybe. If someone steps in soon." She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. That night, Eli sat by the fire, the crate that once held Maple, now cleaned and lined with fresh cloth. Scout sniffed it, tail twitching just once. There was no ceremony, no grand decision, just a quiet understanding. When Hallie pulled up the next morning, the new kitten bundled in blankets on her passenger seat, Eli was already waiting on the porch, sleeves rolled up, kettle on the stove. The lynx was impossibly small, eyes still closed, breathing uneven. "He's got fight," Hallie said, passing the bundle to him. Eli cradled it in his hands, the warmth of life pressing into his palms. "So did Maple," he said softly. Scout whined from the doorway. Eli glanced at her, then stepped inside, Kitten against his chest. The fire burned steady. Another beginning had arrived. The new lynx kitten was smaller than either Birch or Rowan had been. He weighed less than a cup of coffee and had trouble regulating his body temperature. Eli named him Ash, for the color of his fur and maybe for the way he felt like something reborn from the fire. The first week was the hardest, Feedings every 2 hours, warm compresses through the night, endless cycles of stimulation and waiting. Eli's hands ached, his eyes burned. But he moved like a man who'd trained for this his whole life. Scout, old as she was, stayed close to the crate, nose tucked against the slats, rising only when the kitten stirred. Ash mewled differently than the others. It was less of a cry and more of a squeak, sharp and quick, like a breath that didn't quite know it belonged to the world yet. Eli would sometimes mimic it back in a low whistle, and Ash would go still, then try again, louder. They built a rhythm. Hallie stopped by once a week, bringing more formula, scales, updated guides. She never stayed long, just checked Ash's heart, weight, eyes, and quietly observed the way Eli held him. With practiced care, with a steadiness that came from grief healed just enough to try again. "You're doing it again," she said once, her smile soft. "Building bridges no one else sees." By week 3, Ash opened his eyes, pale gray at first, then slowly shifting toward gold. He started crawling, just a few wobbly steps before collapsing into the crook of Eli's flannel sleeve. Eli built him a new enclosure, smaller than the others had used. More padding, lower obstacles. He layered the base with the same wool scarf he'd once wrapped Maple in. He didn't say her name, but he thought of her often. Some nights, Eli would take the rocking chair out onto the porch. Ash tucked inside his shirt, Scout curled at his feet. He'd sit and watch the stars rise over Elk Valley, letting the cool air brush past them all. Sometimes, a lynx call would echo from far off. A high rising trill, wild, distant. Ash would twitch, ears perking, and Eli would whisper, "That's your kin, little one. Someday, you'll answer back." At 6 weeks, Ash pounced for the first time. It was ungraceful, a tumbling dive into a feather toy. But it made Eli laugh harder than he had in months. He caught himself mid-laugh, hand to his chest, and realized it had hurt, not because he'd pulled something, but because it had come from a place he'd kept sealed for too long. Ash grew quickly. Hallie was amazed. By 8 weeks, he was nearly the size Rowan had been at 10. His legs were stronger, his play more coordinated. He showed signs of early confidence, climbing the edge of his enclosure to sit on the window ledge beside Eli while he read. But it wasn't just Ash who changed. Eli found himself reaching for things again. His camera, his fishing rod, a box of letters he'd locked away after his wife died. The house no longer felt like a museum to absence. It had movement again. Breath. Purpose. Then came the moment he hadn't expected. It was a morning like any other. Frost still edging the windows, Scout snoring near the stove. Eli stepped into the enclosure to refill Ash's water. The kitten had been unusually quiet that morning, and Eli had half a mind to worry. Then he saw it. Ash wasn't in the corner where he normally slept. He was perched on the center stump, tail flicking, head high. And beside him, pressed against the fencing, barely visible through the morning mist, was Rowan. Eli froze. The adult lynx didn't move. He didn't growl, didn't run. He just sat, watching. Ash stood slowly, ears pricked, eyes locked onto the older cat. He didn't hiss, didn't cry. He stepped forward and let out a low chirp. Rowan replied, one sound, deep and brief. Then he turned, disappeared into the trees. Eli stood there for a long time, one hand resting on the frame of the door. Scout joined him, nose in the air, tail still. "Guess they're keeping tabs," Eli murmured. He knelt beside Ash, who now paced the fence, ears twitching, alert. "One day, kid," he said, rubbing between the kitten's shoulder blades. "One day, You'll run free with them. And as Ash turned and blinked slowly, not at the fence, but at Eli, he knew. It had already begun. Summer came to Elk Valley slowly, like a guest who wasn't sure they were welcome. The snow receded into the tree line, the creek ran faster, and wildflowers burst from the earth as if remembering they had a job to do. Ash was nearly 3 months old when Eli brought him to visit the sanctuary. It was Hallie's idea. "He needs to start knowing the world beyond your porch," she'd said, though gently, like she knew what that suggestion cost. So Eli packed the crate. Ash muled the whole ride, protesting the bump of the road, the strangeness of motion. Scout rode shotgun, silent and watchful. When they arrived, Eli didn't head straight to the nursery barn. Instead, he walked to the edge of the big enclosure, the one where Rowan and Birch now lived. Hallie had warned him that Rowan was less visible lately, more elusive, especially when visitors came. But not today. Rowan was there. Not on the boulder this time, but in the tall grass near the stream. Birch lounged in a sunbeam not far off, blinking lazily. Eli crouched by the fencing, Ash curled against his chest in a sling. "Look at them," he whispered. "Those are your brothers, in a way. Or maybe something more ancient than that." Ash chirped softly. Birch raised his head. Rowan turned. There was no approach, no drama, just the quiet acknowledgement of something shared. And when Ash wiggled in the sling, pressing toward the fencing, Eli didn't hold him back. He let him see. Let him remember. Let him belong. That night, back at the cabin, the air was warm enough to leave the door open. Scout stretched out on the porch, her breathing slow, rhythmic. Eli sat in his rocker, Ash curled beside his boot. The stars came out one by one, the way they always had. But this time, they felt closer. Somewhere in the valley, a lynx called. Then another. A song, old as stone. Ash sat up, ears perked. He didn't answer, not yet. But his tail flicked once, and he blinked. Eli smiled. In the months that followed, Ash continued to grow. He graduated from the indoor enclosure to the larger pen outside, learned to stalk insects, pounce on lizards, and vanish into brush like a whisper. When Hallie brought 2 more orphans, barely older than newborns, she didn't ask. She just handed them over. And Eli accepted them without a word. Ash watched them from the corner at first, hesitant, but something shifted in him too. One morning, Eli found him curled beside them, grooming their ears, purring low and soft. The cycle had started again. On the first anniversary of Maple's passing, Eli hiked to her grave with a cup of coffee and a worn photograph tucked in his shirt pocket. The stone was weathered now, moss creeping along the edges of the carved leaf. He sat there until the sun rose over the ridge. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, just to the wind, just to the wild. Back at the cabin, the 2 new kittens mewled from the crate, impatient for feeding. Ash was already sitting beside it, tail curled neatly around his paws, eyes steady on the door. Scout watched from her usual place, head resting on her paws. Eli stepped inside, rolled up his sleeves, and smiled. There was always more work to do, always one more wild soul waiting at the edge of silence. And thanks to one lynx mother who hadn't given up, and one man who'd learned to listen, the bridge between loss and life held firm. Even in the quiet, even in the wild, especially there.